December the 31st, an outbreak of a new virus was detected in Wuhan, China. Within a matter of weeks, the World Health Organization reported large outbreaks internationally. And by March the 11th, the dubbed coronavirus was declared a deadly pandemic.
We have rang the alarm bell loud and clear.
The last since swine flu in 2009. A month later, our country faced the reality of the pandemic. A sudden influx of cases and a shift to alert level 2 put the country on edge.
By March 23rd, we had reached 100 cases, cause for serious concern. If the rest of the world was to be learnt from, 100 cases could quickly turn to 1,000, and 1,000 to 1,000,000. Unlike some parts of the world, where economic interests were placed first, in New Zealand we listened to the experts, and so, on the 25th of March, a national lockdown was announced.
Now is the time to act. That's why Cabinet met today and agreed that effective immediately, we will move to alert level 3 nationwide.
For the 70,000 students in New Zealand, that meant learning from home, and for Scots, the Plymouth gates were shut for an indefinite amount of time.
The consequences of the lockdown were massive. Businesses shut down, streets were left empty, and for students aged 5 to 18, schools were forced to close.
With the Prime Minister's announcement, a national lockdown ensued, shutting down educational institutions. On the 23rd of March, the executive decision to close the Plymouth gates was made. A range of emotions were in the air. Some students welcomed the idea of isolation, some were distressed by it.
You know, I was quite surprised and shocked at first, but then I made the realisation that there was no school, so I was quite happy. You know, it felt like a bit of a holiday. And then I made the realisation that we wouldn't be able to see friends, so then I was quite sad. It was quite a roller coaster of emotions.
Well, to be honest, my parents sort of already initiated lockdown in my house. It wasn't really a whole lot different, it's just we couldn't go outside and see people. But I guess the initial reaction was just a bit of shock, like not being able to go outside, not being able to do anything.
FO and marketing, we had a pretty clear indication, Sofia, that things were going to probably start ramping up. Obviously, things were happening all over the world. What we hoped in that week leading up to it was that we were going to get an opportunity to have a little bit more time. If I'm brutally honest, we were sort of cross fingers thinking if we can get to the end of the term, that would be great.
But it was really interesting to get that sense of how all the staff were responding to this, what seemed like just a whole new game, something that we'd never really contemplated before, I suppose, in some way. And it all became very surreal because we'd seen what been happening around the world, but you know, little old New Zealand down the bottom of the world, you know, nothing. Would that ever really affect us?
The lockdown caught most of us off guard, and it was immediately decided this year's Term 2 break would be brought back a week, giving students a 2-week holiday in lockdown, while teachers across the board rushed to compose the DLP, or Distance Learning Plan.
When the holidays did end, students were met with a very different type of schooling. The distance learning plan of Scots College had begun.
I thought they kind of increased the work level, which was interesting, to make sure that we remain self-disciplined, but it was also good preparation for when we come back to school. So then we're almost relieved coming back to school instead of going into school scrambling again.
It went as well as it could possibly go, especially with the short amount of time the teachers had to prepare it. The only downside I think would be something that they can't control was that some people just wouldn't complete their work at all. But that's again something they can't control. But yeah, I think the actual the source and the stuff involved in the distance learning plan was really effective.
Students across prep, middle and senior school would learn completely online. For the majority of us, OneNote and Education Perfect became the new classrooms where daily tasks were set.
Microsoft Teams became the navigation center for everything in the DLP, whether that was contacting teachers or working in groups. Similarly, Zoom and Skype became immediate options when collaborating, though most students agreed the real-life experience couldn't be beat.
To be perfectly honest with you, I didn't really. I just went in with an open mindset and thought, you know what, I've just got to bang it out, be self-disciplined, which yeah, I kind of was, but yeah, I just went in with an open mindset.
So I just did my work early, I set up my computer, I just got everything ready to get back into it.
Learning online meant students had the luxury of waking up later, spending less time in classes, which encouraged boredom and resulted in many classes taken from the comfort of students' beds. Ultimately, from the hours of spare time to the boredom of loneliness, most students agree a day in the life of an East student was what took the longest to get used to.
The implications of the pandemic on student life were massive. Social distancing meant gatherings of any sort were banned, and so after an uncertain 2-week break, homeschooling became the new reality. And it's safe to say that most of us underestimated the changes to come.
It started with school. We went from 5 classes a day in an open campus to learning completely through a computer. For most students, the freedom was refreshing at first, but quickly days spent staring at the same screen became difficult and boring. That's where taking breaks and getting outside became so important. A typical class would consist of a call on Teams where the teacher introduced the work for the day, whether it was OneNote tasks, Kahoots, or standard Education Perfect we all know so well.
Yeah, but the reason I said before that we would have loved to have had 3 or 4 more weeks to implement it is because one of the key areas is that not a lot of our staff or students were used to the Teams approach. We had OneNote up and running, so we were confident with that, but we had an 18-month plan in place to bring staff and students on board with Teams, and we pretty much had to turn around that in about 24, 48 hours.
I got myself into a little routine to make sure I did my school stuff, my exercise, and then chilled. So I thought it was for the better because I got myself into a good routine over lockdown and was really staying ahead.
Additionally, all clubs and teams were cancelled. And so for most of us, especially those with busy schedules, lockdown meant a lot more free time. Some were lucky enough to continue with extracurriculars online, but others weren't, so we had to adapt and sit tight through the lockdown. Wherever the situation was, finding things to keep ourselves busy was key to staying sane.
How much sport was so important to my psyche and to my personal, I suppose, well-being. I mean, I love sport and I love watching sport and not being able to watch live sport, but also my own daughter's sport and being able to go and support. And I love watching student sport. So, you know, I'm here most weekends watching sport or going off at different times during the week to watch it. So that, as much as it freed your time up, there was probably a 2 or 3 week period where that was great because you had some free time. You didn't have to get out in the cold or whatever, but actually that drew pretty thin pretty quickly.
Basically, you know, I still maintained the breaks in the day. I had my interval, walked around the house, got some fresh air. I had my lunch and sat down, took a breather, took a break because you had to, because there would be long days if you didn't. And then basically at 3:30, my partner and I would get our walking shoes on and basically would head out the house and go for a decent walk for at least an hour.
Throughout this phase, the way that we socialised changed. Instead of seeing your friends at school in the weekends or at sport, we learned to video call and interaction became a completely online event. This was a lot to get used to. For most people, extroverted or not, spending months away from close friends was a hard ask. For students with family overseas or even outside of Wellington, being disconnected from extended family was tough. Many of us have grandparents vulnerable to the virus, so tensions were understandably high. Still, our country managed to stay strong, and that is down to the individual Kiwis, from students to caregivers to family members.
We all knew lockdown wasn't going to be easy, but our lifestyles being turned upside down wasn't all bad. The experience taught us how to adapt and to appreciate things we didn't used to. And in times like these, it's quite easy to see the bad, but there was good to be found in lockdown, and that's what we should focus on.
In recent weeks, New Zealand's received overwhelming praise for its handling of COVID-19.
Where experts predicted tens of thousands of cases, we only saw hundreds. Where economic recession was almost certain, businesses have managed to bounce back. Where COVID-19's crippled some of the largest, most powerful nations on Earth, our small, isolated countries managed to, in Winston Peters' words, beat the crap out of the virus.
But we're beating the crap out of it, and so is Australia.
That's because of a lot of things. An excellent Prime Minister, public support, and we can't forget Ashley Bloomfield. Ultimately though, turning the tide on something as dangerous as a pandemic comes down to individuals, small business owners, ordinary citizens, and yes, students.
At Scots, the Plymouth gates are once again open. But as the rest of the world still clashes with this pandemic, we're still vigilant. Still, we think it's fair to be proud of how we've handled the last few months. We were dropped into the deep end, learning completely online, and it's safe to say most of us didn't think that would work out. And we're not saying it was perfect, but the school didn't fall apart, and most of us stayed sane. And hey, we're all still here. At the end of the day, that's all that really matters.